This is the Healthcare Marketplace Specialization, Healthcare Marketplace Overview. My name is Steve Parenti, and this is Module 1.2.1, Market Evolution, Pre-World War II. So let's begin talking about the start of this healthcare marketplace development. One thing that always concerns me is that when people talk about the healthcare system today, they say it's broken, and they don't necessarily recognize that many of the things that make it the way it seems today, it seems maybe broken, is that it's a lot of actions over many different actors over a period of time, and a lot of them are really smart people, and they had their reasons, and they passed on. Many of them are dead, but it's good to know that history, because a lot of times history repeats itself in terms of intentions. So we're going to begin by looking at things at the start of the 20th century with a focus on a man named Abraham Flexner. Flexner was an academic and played a role actually working with Johns Hopkins University in redefining what medical education was. And what Flexner did was he put together a report where he graded the med schools of the day in 1910 and was given money from the philanthropists of the day, John D. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and others, to more or less handpick actually, the medical schools that would likely survive. And they used Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore as a model of an A school. There were many B and C schools that were effectively shut down. This, in the end, actually really reduced the number of medical schools and actually tightened the supply of physicians dramatically going forward. There were new technologies being introduced in this period. Radiology, x-rays were coming online. Salvarsan 606, basically the first drug that really made as not a potion that someone was handing to you, but actually as a pill. There was the federal government starting to get involved with the Pure Food and Drug Act. This later becomes the heart of what will become the FDA. The issue of being concerned about just poisons being put into drugs and other products that people just didn't realize were bad for them, like just, for example, mercury is a key ingredient for life-saving treatment is not really a good idea. And then also in long-term care, the notion most care is coming in rest homes, literally homes where folks would sort of go to either recuperate or not so much recuperate and kind of eased over to the other side. 1910, 1920, we enter World War I. We don't yet have any form of a national health insurance program. We don't talk about it prior to World War I, but we don't do much about it. One thing that comes out of World War I that's very important is the use of antiseptic medicine to reduce hospital mortality rates, and this carries forward into the civilian population in the 1920s. The other thing, as I mentioned before, under the Wilson administration, is to have our first national health insurance attempt that fails, but it is a result. And what needs to be understood is that most of Europe had some form of national health insurance, starting with Germany as way back as 1887. Now, granted, when we look at how Germany put it together with Otto von Bismarck putting it forward and others, is that it was very much a political maneuver. And actually, today, as we probably know, health policy still remains rather political. 1920 to 1930, the Great Depression begins with the crash in 1929. It progresses on through the 30s. Hospitals and doctors are underutilized because basically people aren't affording care. Back in that day, there wasn't insurance. If you were going to go see a hospital or a physician, you had to pay cash. We also have the origin of Blue Cross in Baylor University in Texas in 1929, basically started by the university administration to provide some sort of a basic insurance package for hospital care. That's what Blue Cross begins as. We see also the beginning of group practices. These are coming actually and from the West Coast of the United States, from shipyards where they were already providing hospital care for folks that were working in these heavy industrial industries, and they realized, well, wait, we can do it also for their families, and wait, if we're doing it for their families, why don't we sell this product to other folks? And that becomes the basics for Kaiser Permanente, the largest HMO in the country today. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, is created in 1930, and then also the Veterans Administration is created in 1930. The Veterans Administration is important. People don't realize that the Veterans Administration is not part of the Department of Defense, otherwise known as DoD. It actually is completely separate from that because after World War I, there was a concern that the military was not adequately looking after veterans, and they needed to have their own basically a set of funds that would not be shortchanged depending on the budget for making war or not making war as time went on. 1930s through 1940s. One thing that's not always emphasized is this group here, the AMA. If you Google the AMA, actually the top Google rank is the American Marketing Association, but that's not which one we're talking about. We're talking about the American Medical Association, and they play a huge role in the way healthcare develops in the United States. Not talked about very much really in the last 20 years or so, but they paid more money into lobbying against having any sort of national health insurance than probably any other group, inflation-adjusted dollars, probably any dollars going back for nearly 70 years. They also were against socialized medicine, and by that they did not mean a government insurance. They actually meant they were against group practices. Group practices are all over the place today, but at the time, the AMA made their money by dues, one physician at a time, and so they would lose on that money if they actually had many group practices. Philanthropists and also New Deal legislation subsidized a lot of the beginning of academic medical centers across the United States. Hospitals and doctors continue to face underutilization due to very poor economic conditions, though Blue Cross plans start to grow. We have the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act coming on in 1939, basically toughening up the FDA. We have sulfa drugs. This is major to create and treat conditions like pneumonia. This is actually going to be a radical thing to eventually get rid of tuberculosis, which is the major killer up until this point, more so than lung cancer or anything else in the United States at this point. And we have our second attempt at national health insurance through the New Deal legislation of Franklin Roosevelt. The 1940s through the 50s is also a very dynamic time. World War II really sets the stage for so many things that happen going forward in the 20th century for American medicine. There's the development and the use of antibiotics like penicillin and the mass production of penicillin that's happened as part of World War II. That's a huge issue, has great consequences going forward. Hill-Burton Act of 1946 basically goes and puts a tremendous amount of capital into the construction of hospital and nursing homes throughout the United States. And mostly because a lot of the facilities were older, they were undercapitalized because of the Depression, and really pretty disease-ridden, honestly. And so really a major transformation went on at that point. We also have the proliferation of what will become a major tax subsidy really to many people across the United States, the proliferation of employer-sponsored health insurance. This happens in World War II. It actually happens in 1943. There is a recession that is actually occurring during the war, and part of it is because basically workers are not being permitted by the government to get additional wages to keep costs down. The employers and unions ask essentially for instead to give out this newfangled health insurance thing to their employees, but they don't want to have them pay taxes on it, and they want to retain the good workers that build these planes and ships and everything else. And so this is actually approved and later becomes today a $260 billion a year subsidy. We'll talk more about that later. The Carrion-Ferguson Act starts up here. This is essentially not just for health insurance, but it basically says an insurance has to be sold on a state or regional level. It cannot be sold across state lines. The Veterans Administration starts to grow dramatically, mostly because of the consequence of World War II and vets coming home. We have our third attempt in the Truman Administration for national health insurance legislation, probably the closest it's ever come, but yet it fails. This concludes this module on the healthcare marketplace evolution in Module 1.